Hey everyone, before I get going, I wanted to say thank you to anyone who has taken the time to even listen to a minute of this podcast over the last few months. It really means the world. This is going to be my final episode of the year, but I will be back in 2022 with a project I'm extremely excited about. While I don't want to give everything away yet, this last episode should give you a sneak peek as to what I'll be diving into for a full season a few months down the line. I'll be back soon, but until then, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Last episode, I focused on countries with some of the most press freedom in the world. This week, I'm going to focus on one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists as well as elected officials, but also a place that is incredibly important to me: Mexico. Due largely to organized cartel violence, crimes in Mexico are rarely solved, and often, people who speak out against violence end up becoming victims themselves. Cartel violence has affected several aspects of society in Mexico, stretching all the way to rural communities people like much of my family live in. One of the most prominent ways cartels have undeniably shifted power in the country is through politics. Both in working with corrupt politicians and silencing the voices of those they deem opponents, they have turned the current situation of several parts of Mexico into what some refer to as a narco state. Earlier this year, Mexico went through the largest election cycle in the nation's history, and also one of its most violent. I have long been following the political climate in Mexico, and these last few months have brought with them some of the most tragic stories in recent years. So today, I wanted to discuss the events of 2021 and how, in a way, they are a microcosm of a decades long conflict. Although, like just about every country on earth, there is a history of drug trafficking that dates far back. Significant impact from cartel presence was not felt until the 80s and 90s, when the United States shut down most incoming cocaine shipments through the Caribbean, and Colombian cartels began working with Mexican cartels, creating new routes, many of which are still in operation today. Back then, although cartels in Mexico were entering the trafficking industry, most were not big on cocaine production. Many regions offer the perfect climate for outdoor and grown cannabis, making it incredibly easy to produce, but beyond that, and pretty small amounts of heroin. Although drugs were coming into Mexico, they weren't really being made there. However, as opioid use was skyrocketing in the United States, Mexican cartels began investing more in production, especially heroin, as poppy grows easily in various regions throughout the country. By 2006, the Mexican government had begun their own version of a war on drugs. However, very much like the tactics in the American war on drugs, drug busts, bursting through doors, locking up low-level cartel and gang members, none of these efforts thwarted overall drug production or consumption. Sure, there's situations like a $207 million drug bust in Mexico City out of a meth operation and a record-breaking bust of 23.5 metric tons of cocaine, but these flashy, headline-capturing tactics may have actually contributed to more violence. Because although cartels frequently fight amongst themselves without outside help, if organizations are in a truce, but government agencies are affecting their bottom dollars, eventually there's not enough wealth to go around and conflicts get hot again. It's not just the cartels that start fights due to these methods. Local, state, and federal operatives often clash, and with corruption taking place at all levels, distrust runs rampant. Even if you're an honorable soldier, someone who genuinely joined to try and do good, what happens when your commander is working for a cartel? If you're in government and you fear the candidate you work for is being paid off, what do you do? Especially since knowing that speaking out could get you killed. After all, numerous entirely innocent individuals have suffered the ultimate consequence as a result of this conflict. In Guerrero, my father's home state, one of the most infamous examples of this is the disappearance of 43 student teachers. The official account of the occurrence is widely disputed, but it is thought that the students were stopped by local police officers and eventually handed over to the Guerreros Unidos, a crime syndicate which, beyond drug trafficking, is widely known for its extortion and kidnapping tactics. There's all sorts of theories. Some think the buses the students were traveling in were carrying mass amounts of heroin, and despite being unaware of the transport, all riders were killed as collateral damage. Some believe the Mexican army was directly involved. And that's the complicated thing about violence in Mexico. At times, it seems that there is truly no one to trust or turn to. In Mexico, it is estimated that roughly 95% of all violent crimes go unsolved. It's a baffling statistic that can be hard to wrap your head around. This knowledge, however, may make the numerous killings of political figures make more sense. If a candidate or a politician advocates for the taking down of organized crime, what better way to send a message than silencing those who represent a threat to your business? So, why was this year, this election in particular, filled with so much violence? Well, this is not exactly something new. Falco Ernst, a Mexico City-based analyst with the International Crisis Group, says, "The difference now is that you have a greater amount of criminal actors out there all trying to push into the state, which provides lots of points of frictions and causes and explains why the competition over the state has become so overly voracious these days. It's essentially become impossible to weed out people working for or with criminal syndicates, as they have ingrained themselves so deeply in politics and in many situations are at all-time highs in personnel. Mexican and U.S. officials believe that now over 200 crime gangs operate in Mexico. For members of the press, reporting on the election has proven almost as dangerous as running for office itself. With over 90% of crimes against the press committed without any arrests or convictions being made, it is a known risk to report on a number of topics, most prominently cartel activity, of course, and also politics. This past May, journalist Luis Raúl Aguilar Pérez was severely injured in his home state of Guanajuato, where he covers politics. He was unable to identify the assailant, but believes they were attempting to slit his throat. Thankfully, he survived, but others have not been as fortunate. Reporter Julio Valdivia was found beheaded in Veracruz last September after having received numerous death threats and recently reporting on crime and security. The area is a hotspot for trafficking, so while the cause is almost certainly known, as of now, no one has been arrested. Cartel-sanctioned attacks, however, aren't the only reason for the violence. There's situations like the killing of Alma Rosa Barragan Santiago, a mayoral candidate of Moroleon, which her daughter, Alma Denise, says was not committed by criminal organizations, but strictly desires for political power. While her belief can't be proven 100% one way or the other, the fact that politicians are experiencing so much infighting beyond cartel influence shows how dangerous it is to become a leader in the community. Despite the danger, Alma Denise made the decision to take her mother's place in the election and won the candidacy in early June, less than 2 weeks after she had laid Alma Rosa to rest. As of early June, when elections took place, and since the previous September, when the majority of campaigning got going, there have been hundreds of recorded attacks, 35 candidates killed, and if you count political aides, workers, and campaign officials, 89 individuals working in politics have been murdered. This rampant violence has led to tension at the highest levels of government. Many feel Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has not done enough to reduce violence in the country. Although he pulls high when it comes to things like honesty and not being tied to corruption, his efforts in ending cartels' massive power in the country have been critiqued. As a presidential candidate, the populist figure pushed for the strategy of abrazos no balazos, hugs, not bullets, which is a lovely sentiment, but struggled to become a reality. He argued that pushing for more jobs and better wages, especially for younger people in rural parts of the country, would discourage individuals from wanting to join cartels. While violence levels have remained at some of the highest ever in Mexico, he is right so far in that the more aggressive, violent tactics to combat the war on drugs have been proven to be quite ineffective. Previous presidents have won the candidacy on a platform of directly targeting cartels and trying to end them once and for all, but as I said before, these tactics don't work when the product remains in high demand. If the CEO of McDonald's was assassinated tomorrow, you think they won't be able to sell Big Macs or 10-piece nugs like they always do? Think they'd go out of business if half their top corporate board got taken out? No way, because when you sell a product that popular, no matter the danger or risk, someone is going to step in and take those jobs. In a way, you can't blame Obrador for diverging from previous mindsets. After all, Obrador's predecessor, Enrique Nieto was accused of being bribed $100 million US by none other than Joaquin El Chapo Guzman himself. Of course, this was during Guzman's court trials following extradition to the United States, so he may have just been throwing a Hail Mary because why not? But by then, he must have known he would never walk free again. I don't know. Could be true. Could be a final FU to a man whose administration jailed him, then biffed it, and allowed Guzman to escape, sparking wide criticism, and then eventually jailed him again. You never know. A switch up in the tactics of the war on drugs was necessary, but if you stop sending out wave after wave of soldiers to combat the cartels, and the violence doesn't stop, and in some ways it gets worse, well, people are less inclined to feel like hugs and not bullets are the way to go. I'm not saying people are out looking for blood, but if you feel unprotected in your own community, it's hard not to want more aggressive security. Just look at gun ownership rates in places like Portland and Seattle pre and post 2020 for an example or two. Obrador has been in a tricky situation over the last year or so, as you have several cases of cartels handing out food during the pandemic as his administration refused mass loanouts to businesses for fear of increasing the nation's debt. No president since the start of the war on drugs, in Mexico or the United States, has successfully brought forth a plan to end the violence, so I only focus on Obrador because he's currently the player at bat. With Mexico's recent elections over, attacks directly targeted at politicians and political aides have subdued, but that hasn't stopped violence throughout the country. There's places like the city of Fresnillo, located in the central state of Zacatecas. For a while, the city remained largely untouched by cartel business. However, around 2007, as the Mexican government's aggressive tactics splintered some of the most powerful criminal organizations, ongoing conflicts between warring cartels became prominent. Children have been kidnapped, disappeared, and only to have their bodies dumped in the streets shortly thereafter. Teenagers are targeted for both recruitment and assassinations, as any young adults, especially young men, not affiliated with a cartel, run the risk of being recruited by another. For the past decade and a half, the city has gone through economic booms and busts and changes to political agendas, but the violence stays the same. It's a position many cities and towns have found themselves in since the early 21st century. This last round of elections put a magnifying glass on the issue, but ultimately, the most tragic part of the political violence is that it is an incredibly small fraction of the overall terror many in the country face. I want to stop here simply to say that this is an international issue that is currently affecting Mexico in some of the worst ways, but in no way is this an issue created in the country. A number of factors keep many parts of Mexico at the front lines of drug and political related violence, but it's not a Mexican problem. It's a problem currently in Mexico, one that continues to see no end in sight. Beyond military deployments and attempts at bolstering job opportunities, the Mexican government is currently in the process of discussing cannabis legalization. Back in March, Mexico's lower house, the Chamber of Deputies, voted to legalize recreational cannabis in a 316 to 129 decision, coming a little over 2 years after their Supreme Court ruled that the country's ban on recreational cannabis was unconstitutional, more than 3 years after they had legalized cannabis for medicinal use. However, as June approached and elections neared, politicians focused less on the divisive issue, especially considering recent polling suggests 2/3 of Mexicans actually disapprove of legalization. This lack of a response led to their Supreme Court approving something called the General Declaration of Unconstitutionality, an action only used once before in Mexican history. The court declared that their previous ruling deeming a lack of recreational legalization unconstitutional must be enacted, meaning that immediately personal consumption of cannabis in Mexico was legalized. The Senate will reconvene in September, where they will discuss specifics such as guidelines regarding farming licensing, distribution, and personal cultivation. This action is hopefully going to positively affect many people. However, implications that it could make a significant impact on cartel violence are largely outdated. As several U.S. states have voted to legalize the federally controlled substance, the market for Mexican-grown cannabis has greatly diminished. Currently, cannabis is fully legal in 15 states, while only 5 remain entirely legal, with many having medicinal or CBD options in their states. Many operations in legal states such as California and Oregon are currently distributing to illegal states with much less risk than it is for cartels to attempt to bring in cannabis from Mexico, especially considering, in comparison to things like fentanyl and methamphetamine, it requires much more space to smuggle and often for a much lower price. While the Mexican bill states that the government intends to give small farmers and indigenous communities priority when it comes to farming licensing, there is fear that cartel influence will mean that these farmers will have to pay them a tax or won't be able to operate altogether. The implications of cannabis legalization still could be huge, as Mexico, with its population of over 127 million people, would become the largest legal market in the world. However, there is still little reason to believe it would put a large dent in the cartel industry and could potentially even bolster it. These past elections were a clear sign that, 15 years in, through multiple presidencies and tactics, there is still no end in sight to the widespread cartel presence and government corruption. The true struggle for Mexicans hoping for change is, I would argue, no matter what the tactics people in Mexico take, cartels in the country are so deeply intertwined in international business that, as I said before, this is a global issue. Fingers can be pointed at the producers, the consumers, the distributors, lawmakers, law enforcers, but at the end of the day, when there are billions of dollars to be made, history has shown us that there is about a 100% chance you can find someone willing to do just about anything for a piece of the pie. While occurrences such as the current opioid epidemic are a modern issue, humans have been ingesting narcotics for thousands and thousands of years, and there's no sign of us slowing down anytime soon. As more countries likely join places like the Netherlands, Portugal, and Switzerland in establishing nationwide decriminalization of drug use and possession, it will be interesting to see how the cartel's bottom dollars are affected. Because while some places are becoming increasingly pro-decriminalization of drug use and possession, trafficking and production still remain tricky subjects. While more people are comfortable with not severely punishing someone for consuming drugs, the idea of having things like state-sanctioned heroin clinics or meth factories in operation is much more difficult for people to wrap their head around. With over a quarter of the population under 15, Mexico is currently a fairly young nation, and the decisions made by those within their nation and across the world over the next couple of decades will affect the society this young generation lives in. Mexico is obviously a nation near and dear to my heart, but as I end, I think it's important to note that, throughout at least the modern history of drug trafficking, if violence leaves one area, it's because it's gone on to another. It wasn't too long ago that cocaine was directly associated with Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel in Colombia. In the 21st century, drug-related violence in Central America has ramped up dramatically. This international game of whack-a-mole has proven time and time again to be ineffective. While I certainly don't want Mexico to continue to be plagued with the violence many regions have seen for years and years, there is a way too optimistic part of me that hopes Mexico can be the last place a drug war of this size is ever fought. Fickle Future is written, edited, and produced by me, Ruben Estrada. Music by Hobby Beats. You can find all of his work on Linktree/HobbyBeats. The URL is located in the episode's description. Cover art by Alora Batson. As always, thank you for listening.